Workplace violence? Well, the government's still saying that horrific beheading in Oklahoma was just that, not an act of terror, despite several of Alton Nolan's co-workers saying he tried to convert them to Islam, and despite his Facebook page showing graphic images of beheadings and Osama bin Laden. Now, some here say not calling it what it is could put more workers and Americans in danger. Are they right? Hi, everybody. I'm David Asman. Welcome to Forbes on Fox. Let's go in focus with Steve Forbes, Rich Karlgaard, Elizabeth McDonald, Sabrina Schaefer, Bruce Japsen, and John Tamney. Steve, workplace violence?
This is sophistry and semantics, David, on steroids, and it's very dangerous. Why this administration has its head in the sand on this is just absolutely bizarre and murderous. The administration, in terms of terrorism, it's not controlled by a central authority. Terrorists know if you operate as individuals, as small groups, very hard for authorities to stop it. This guy was a terrorist, pure and simple. Recognize it, like Fort Hood, terrorism.
Bruce, that's right. I think they're still calling Fort Hood workplace violence, even though that seems to me to be terrorism, doesn't it to you?
Well, I don't know about the terrorism thing. I mean, the guy is being charged with murder. He faces the death penalty. I don't know if Oklahoma, we can say, is the Haight-Ashbury of politically correctness. I think that, we have a situation in Chicago where there was a gentleman who sabotaged the FAA station. What is the definition of terrorism? How do we define that?
Well, Sabrina, it's not hard when you look at the emails of this guy, you look at his website, his Facebook page, everything points to the direction of him being encouraged by what he was doing and who he was in contact with. That looks like terrorism.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important that the government actually recognize his motivations as terrorist motivations, because as Steve recognized, we had the Fort Hood shooting in 2009. They missed all of the dots. 13 people were killed. Again, now we're seeing this. And this beheading, this has been sort of a trademark of Al-Qaeda, now of ISIS. I mean, let's not forget, this went all the way back to Daniel Pearl back in 2002. This is very serious. We absolutely need to take this as a terrorist action.
Daniel Pearl, by the way, the Wall Street Journal writer and reporter who was beheaded in Pakistan. John, what do you think?
I don't know. I'm not trying to minimize what was obviously a hideous act, but my view is that there's just a lot of awful people in the world, and sometimes they pull things like this off. If anything, I think it's more of a copycat act, but to call it an act of terrorism seems to me a bit of a reach.
Rich, I think you got to name it what it is. That's how you start nipping it out, right?
You absolutely do, and Steve is right on the mark on this, is that terrorism is a widely dispersed organization built around ideas, and if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, and if the workplace violence is accompanied by jihadism and beheadings and things like that, it's terrorism. I'm glad Fort Hood was mentioned. 13 died, and the government is still reluctant to call it terrorism. I think this government, particularly this administration, would sooner find terrorism in the Ferguson Police Department than they would with the obvious terrorist acts.
EMAC, it's tough enough to get them to say the word terrorist. To head off a threat, though, you've got to be willing to acknowledge it first. That's part of what led to the growth of ISIS, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And if you don't name it, then you're purposely, consciously trying to bury it so it doesn't appear to be a problem. Listen, the writing was on the Facebook wall for this guy, and this is basically dishonest political correctness, also on steroids. I mean, this is narcissism. People who care in the media more, or in the government, more about their own self-regard than the safety of Americans at work and their regard, how they think about civil rights. Listen, there's no more greater violation of civil rights than being beheaded at work. This woman was a grandmother, and she deserves the safety. And by the way, to John Tamney's point, terrorists are copycats. They are copycat killers. So that's why we've got to focus on the threat here in the United States and stop it and wipe it out.
John, go ahead.
Well, it kind of reminds me of when politicians try to say, well, we've got to stop hate crimes. I can't think of a crime where someone is murdered that's not a hate crime. And so to me, an act of terrorism is almost superfluous.
But John, you're diminishing it. John, you're absolutely diminishing it. Listen, in Israel, they would not call this workplace violence. Israel has a good, solid bar for what they call terrorism. We need to call this a terrorist attack. It was fueled by terrorist ideology.
And Steve, the fact is what really is of great concern with the terrorist terrorists right now is their conspiracy. They're working together. Their interconnections. We should mention, by the way, the Justice Department, just at this moment, would probably we have to look at those connections harder than ever before, announced they are going to have new broad restrictions about racial and religious profiling. Probably the wrong time to roll that out, no?
Absolutely. Wrong time to do it, and it's another example of this administration hindering our own safety. And in terms of terrorism, David, thanks to the internet, thanks to modern communications, you don't need a centralized control. They see what's going on elsewhere. That's a signal to them. Try it here. Do it where you can, so the authorities can't stamp it out and make it look like the authorities are impotent and this thing is going to triumph.
And, Bruce, it does appear that the administration is going out of its way to avoid calling anything terrorism, doesn't it?
Well, I think Emac brought up a point about Israel having a solid bar. I mean, I don't know if we have a solid definition of terrorism. I mean, you talk about this situation in Chicago where somebody sabotaged the FAA control center with planes in the air, and they're canceling hundreds of flights daily here in Chicago.
Was there an ideology behind that? Bruce, was there an ideology? Right. So if there's an ideology discovered on this guy's Facebook page, then why not call it Islamic
terrorism? And Sabrina, the fact that we don't know is of great concern, and that's why the Justice Department and the entire administration should be working hard to make those terrorist connections, because if there is a connection, we got to stop it now.
Oh, absolutely. And look, one of the reasons that we want to identify this as a terrorist threat is so that we can try to stop these kind of attacks before they happen. The whole point of this is that we know that there are members of Al-Qaeda, members of ISIS who are trying to radicalize Americans so that they can come back to the United States and create this kind of harm. And we don't know if this was actually part of an organized effort or not, but we absolutely need to try to put those dots together, because I expect that we're going to see more of this.
Rich, Sabrina brings up a great point. There are those hundreds or maybe even thousands of radicals that have access to U.S. passports or green cards who are probably going to come back, try to stir up trouble, and they're probably going to disguise themselves in these community centers. So we got to find out which ones are good and which ones are giving cover to these guys.
You know, if someone does not, there are sleepers in this country, I think they're absolutely naive. And it turns out that there are a lot of connections to these apparently unconnected murders. The Fort Hood murder was in contact with a Yemenis terrorist, it turned out. And so we don't know if this latest killer was in contact. It remains to be seen. But he certainly was absorbing ideas from ISIS.
By the way, Steve, right after 9/11, there were calls out from the government, from the administration, then the Bush administration, for workplaces to really be vigilant about who's doing what, particularly if there are any terrorist connections. Bush had no problem using the word terrorist or war on terrorism or anything, but this administration does. Should the workplace be a place that does focus a little more on paying attention to these things?
Well, you don't want to be overly intrusive, David, but if a person is out there soliciting, trying to convert people in the workplace, you know you might have a problem. You ought to look into it. The name should go on the radar. And so those are basic common sense things. You don't have to snoop. If the guy's out there soliciting, as this guy was, or you take a look at his Facebook page, which millions of people can do, you can see this guy's got a problem.
And Sabrina, I don't want to open a whole nother can of worms here, but this guy was stopped from doing more harm by an administrator who had a gun. The gun was responsible for stopping this guy from committing another beheading. He was already stabbing somebody else. What does that tell you about whether we should be that vigilant in terms of allowing guns in the workplace?
Well, I was sort of amazed by that. You always hear about these different stories in which guns have actually stopped violence, and this was one of them that we really haven't heard a whole lot of reporting on. I think it's going to be left up to individual businesses to decide if they want that kind of environment, and they have to be transparent with their employees about it, but it was certainly an interesting part of the story.
Bruce, very quickly, go ahead.
I don't know about guns in the workplace. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay.
I don't agree with that at all.
All right. We had two sides on that quick issue. Meanwhile, massive pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong catching the world's attention. But if you think